Most noble citizens, we must bypass a life of dormancy and vice to pursue the generative endeavor of a hard day's work. The benefits of these pursuits are not secured by chance or charity, but through the merit of your character and the firmness of your convictions. It is you who are planting the seeds of trees whose shade you know you shall never see.
What up? What up? Hello. Welcome.
Florida Part 5.
Time for Hell on the Beach. We're back in Florida. It's your boys, the dynamic duo, the partners in crime, but not real crime. We got the Pirate Vane, the super producer himself, and myself, co-host, your pal,
the boy Butler.
You're a Florida man for this podcast. And
really need a Florida man.
You needed a Florida man. I'm here with my vape and my Crocs, just ready to tell the story of this place. Because Floridians, we're always on the cutting edge of degeneracy. That's how we do things. But
authentic.
In all seriousness, today is going to be a very special episode. We're going to tell the story of two men and their conquest through Florida. The first one is a farce. The second one is a tragedy.
Indeed.
And you'll know one of these characters very well. The first one you may not be quite as familiar with, but I think my co-host wanted to take a second up top to sort of connect a few threads from the last episode about the British and then just sort of give us a little summary on where we last left off. Do you want to take it from there, my friend? I'm going to vape up.
Yeah, as we do these podcasts in an improvisatory way, we inevitably end up missing a detail here or there. And last episode, we felt like we missed kind of a significant detail. We had talked about how the British would ultimately lose Florida, but we also left the episode feeling like we didn't really give the
on how they
exact
got Florida,
details.
You mean?
On how they got it and how they lost it within a matter of 20 years, ultimately.
Right.
And those time periods are 1763 through 1783 that the British would hold Florida, which is a very short time, but they would split the huge region, which, remember, was almost the entire southeast of North America.
Right.
And they divided it into East and West Florida and established the two headquarters of Pensacola and St. Augustine. And so Britain ultimately lost Florida in 1783, primarily through the Treaty of Paris, which also was the treaty that ended the American Revolutionary War. And Spain was an ally of France and the U.S. at the time and captured British strongholds like Pensacola and regained control of both East and West Florida, which it had ceded to the British in 1763.
And remember, listener, East and West Florida is not what East and West Florida is today. All of basically Florida you'd think of today is Eastern Florida, and Western Florida is like Mississippi Delta area. So you gotta, we appreciate you bearing with us. These are like complex and fast moving details. The late 18th century into the early 19th century of Florida is what I believe the Chinese would call interesting times for everyone who lived there. It's a lot of turmoil and upheaval in a relatively short period. So we appreciate you bearing with us when we, breeze past a detail or two if it happens. We're trying our best.
Yeah, and so it was the Spanish forces led by Bernardo de Galvez, which launched successful campaigns to capture the key British positions at West Florida. And that Spanish victory at the Battle of Pensacola in 1781 effectively ended the British control over the region.
So something else, too, I guess I want to say at the top of this episode, because we feel that we're so lucky to be telling this story now and to be the ones to be able to do it, because it is just so incredibly relevant, and you'll see those details come through here. But I think about also the bind that the Spanish found themselves in during, their colonial heyday, which was one, just a misunderstanding of economics, and two, a failure of power projection across the Atlantic Ocean. I think that with the technology they had at the time, they came up against some very real and very significant barriers on just how are we, this country on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, going to ostensibly impose our political order onto this country that's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right. And that cost kind of becomes too much for any of the European empires ultimately to hold over the Americans.
The Portuguese find their own sort of workaround, but yeah.
Because the Americans are right there in close proximity, so it's almost like an efficiency that they can conquer the region much easier than a European empire.
Exactly. And now we're in this era where we have this hegemonic globe-spanning power with forts and bases all over the world that has already and will continue to run up against the real challenges and, quite frankly, impossibilities of power projection over, the freaking Atlantic Ocean. And obviously, the technology has improved. We've, done a little better than the Spanish Empire. But I do think that there's a reason that the Eye of Sauron of the U.S. Empire has once again turned back to its own backyard, because at the end of the day, that's the old stomping grounds. And that's kind of the story we're here to tell. That's the place where they originally built themselves up as like the kind of world bully they've gone on to be in the post-World War II era. But this chapter and the next one, 6 and 7, are incredibly compelling in my opinion, and I'm very excited to get into these.
Right. Yeah, and so we want to get through 1.5 chapters if possible. The first chapter will be chapter 6 of Finding Florida by T.D. Allman, and that chapter is called The Unseen Foe.
Yes.
Which we will talk about when that is brought up.
Keep that concept in your mind, dear listener. The unseen foe. The foe that cannot be explained is the narco-terrorist, the one who is up to unexplainable and unprovable criminal acts that they must be stopped at all costs, even though we're, hundreds of miles away and actually are doing it for our own economic self-interests. That's, and, in some cases in very plain terms.
Yeah.
That's the story we're going to tell.
Right. Yeah, and so this is a lot that we're trying to cover very quickly, so we're going to jump right in from here, I think, and start covering chapter 6.
Yeah.
So here we go. So after Jefferson had authorized the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. grabbed the Florida parishes, but the rest of Florida was still not under their control.
So, I want to take some time on each, even though we're going to move quickly. I also want to make sure we take time to appreciate each of the characters that come into this.
Yeah.
Because there's some presidents that play some important roles, but I think the 3 main characters of these chapters would be Vicente Folk, who we're about to meet, a certain General George Matthews, who is one of the funniest characters of the book, I would say, and we'll have a lot of fun with him. And then we are going to encounter...
Yep, although we're supposed to take him seriously.
Very serious. But then we're going to encounter the demonic personage of Old Hickory himself, and that will be quite a portrait we're going to try and paint when we get to him. But let's start with the story of Vicente Folk and how that leads to Matthews and leads to Jackson. So, Mr. Folk was the Spanish official in West Florida because, as I said, the nature of Spanish power projection at this point, and it was tenuous even before this, but by now it is just incredibly tenuous. The Spanish are basically holding on for like what they can maintain, and that is some forts.
Right.
And then the economic arrangements that they are able to make with the people who live there that are advantageous for both of them because they can't really make anything else. Like they only have so limited capacity.
Yeah, and the French very quickly flipped the territory with Napoleon, as we talked about last time.
And that will happen again, too, if you can believe it. Another Bonaparte will be trading real estate in Florida not too far from here. That's way ahead,
Yeah, and then the current president at this time of the United States, President Madison, worried that he would lose this land to the Spanish, who had outfought the British in Florida, as we covered at the beginning of this episode.
Because remember, Louisiana Purchase has happened, and they have a lot of land, but they don't have East Florida. They don't have the full pie that they're after. The peninsula of Florida is not an American possession at this point.
Right. And now, so we're at the profile of Vicente Folk.
Yes.
Who is the governor, highest ranking Spanish official in West Florida. And he's willing to play both sides for the best possible deal.
Yeah. I think Vicente Folk, as like an archetype, how I understand him too, as like a person from this region, is like, we love deals down here in the Caribbean. We love, and there's so many very evil deals that have been made in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
We know a certain Mr. Epstein made many of them, and we've had many a cohort work with him. But overall, like,
and it's your own autonomy, where
exactly.
you don't have to feel under control of any one particular government.
Right.
You have ultimately the control into which country you're going to buy into, ultimately.
And you're in this position
and that
where,
gives you a little bit of leverage.
Exactly. And you press that because you ultimately, like, I don't like Vicente Folk is we'll call him a five-star player of the story. He's definitely one of the only one of the few, like, unscathed, I would say, like, almost. Right, exactly. And T.D. Allman makes note of that. But it's like this very, like, pan-Caribbean, like, personage of, like, the Spanish person who understands, can work with anyone, and, like, knows how to make a deal. And, like, that is what Vicente Folk does here by trying to play both sides of this thing. And I'll let you, lay out the detail
so we
on
have
that.
A quote of Vicente Folk saying, "I have decided on delivering this province to the U.S. under an equitable capitulation, provided I do not receive succor from Havana or Veracruz during the present month."
I think it said sucre.
And this is kind of like a gun in the first act, or like a canary in the coal mine.
Right.
Because I'm going to spoil this for you. This deal does not ultimately work out.
Well, it does work out for Vicente Folk, but not for the people of Florida, certainly.
He's playing both sides.
He's playing both sides, is what you need to understand, is that Vicente Folk is here in this fort in southern Florida with, like, probably a dozen guys and this letter from the Spanish crown, and he has the Yankee Leviathan north of him saying, like, clearly interested in what's going on there, and he's underfunded and sending a letter to both places to say, hey, I'm basically I'm renewing my contract. Like, I need something. Like, right. We're talking, this is what my rate is now. And
I'm an independent contractor now, and you're gonna have to give me a better deal. Sweeten the pot here a little for me on both sides.
Right. And for you, dear listener, just a reminder, when you're in this kind of, when you're in between two powerful parties, never neglect to press your advantage. It's always a good thing. That's a lesson I think we can take from Mr. Folk.
That's a lesson from Folk.
He's a cool guy. I mean, it's like because again, it's like this guy is one of the few people to, especially on the Spanish side, to navigate the morass of Floridian, like, early national politics and come out unscathed.
He presses the deal just the right amount. He doesn't overstep his bounds. He plays his cards exactly
too much. Like, he's very true. So,
and, as we get into him, we'll see that more and more. So Florida had become the center of attention in Washington and Spain, which is another kind of crazy part that ties this place into the whole world, as we talk about with the butterfly effect.
It's a very international place.
So many international ties. So yet again, Florida becomes the center of attention, with Mr. Folk being able to
get both Washington and Spain to say, like, oh, we need to make this guy happy ASAP.
Right.
Because the Yankees want America, and the Spanish don't want to lose what little, like, economic advantage they have left from colonialism, because they, we're not that good at holding on to that. Bless their hearts.
Right. And so as part of these recurring rhythms that keep happening, the Kemper brothers were discarded by Madison in his previous attempt after he got caught in this scandalous filibuster, essentially, which is like an illegal land grab, which we're going to see more and more examples of this. And so now we're getting into the profile of George Matthews.
General George Matthews. Get it right,
General,
buddy.
Don't forget.
So for starters, that's one of my favorite details when I read it. I was like, what? He's stealing valor. Don't you? So George Matthews
Anytime we say that, that's in air quotes.
George Matthews was not in any military. He was captured during the war in 1812, I think, and declared himself a general for the rest of his life. George Matthews...
He was captured in the War of Independence.
Could be the most...
But he was a British prisoner in the War of Independence.
I'm going to give some background on George Matthews, because I think that to the whole hell, the one that we feel we're trying to contribute to, the hell of presidents, hell on earth, hell on the beach trying to be in there, but this guy might be the most quintessentially American guy in a lot of ways. And because he was through some confusing antagonistic process via the same, imprisonment you're describing there, and you can probably give us some more detail on it, but he basically found a way to finagle himself into some literal free real estate in his life and spent the entire rest of his life trying to basically recreate those circumstances of getting free real estate. And we'll put the free real estate drop in there, but listener, if you're familiar with those shows, you know that like an American colonial guy who's just obsessed with getting free real estate, it's like so on the nose. It's like we could have, but it's just what we have here. We have General George Matthews, a pretend general obsessed with getting free real estate, who happens to be one of the few people who has met Vicente Folk in the past. Yeah. And that makes him very important in Washington all of a sudden, despite being, a George Santos type figure, I expect, otherwise. But right. Would you have any more detail on his free real estate, too? I don't know. I forget how he got the first to pull out.
Yeah, he's really a failed real estate speculator, and he gets implicated in this scandal called the Yazoo land grab, and he's also a disgraced ex-politician for that reason. But so after being a prisoner of war in the War of Independence, he demands 20,000 acres of free real estate from Washington as compensation. And the legislature eventually does give him several thousand acres. And free real estate becomes an obsession of his from that point on. It's free real estate. So then he gets implicated in the Yazoo land grab, which was in January of 1795. Matthews was the governor of Georgia, authorized this scandalous land grab, which was not only repealed, but actually burned to satisfy popular outrage. And then after that, Matthews moves to the Mississippi Territory, where officials did not have to be elected, and he finagled himself a position as governor there. And then this title was denied to him once they found out about his controversy with the Yazoo speculations. So he lived as a disgrace from that point forward until President Matthews called him into a private meeting in January 1811 with no other witnesses and no transcript made. And Matthews was one of the few people who had been to West Florida and had actually met Vicente Folk, as Butler mentioned.
God, being too ravenously hungry for this new land to expand your colony in it for the Georgia colonists of the early 19th century.
And they kicked him out in a scandal.
And I feel like we do owe it to our listeners at some point to do a deep dive. We do owe it to ourselves to do a deep dive on the Georgia colony and James Oglethorpe and like the strange sort of, idiosyncratic nature of that colony in comparison to its northern cousin, but it's still a deeply racist and problematic, colonial project that certainly has an expansionary vision, and we'll get to that later on. So it's like Georgia colonists being like, dude, what you're doing is so, having to burn this. He's a guy, but
a law that he made, it's pretty insane.
It's
to be that outraged.
General Matthews.
Yeah, so moving on, Madison and Matthews have this secret meeting, and both of them actually leave the meeting believing that West Florida is ripe for the taking. Matthews is given written orders to follow up the secret meeting, and he's told to proceed with all possible expedition, concealing from general observation the nature of his mission. Then he was told to proceed with discretion, which the delicacy and importance of the undertaking require. And he was told if the Spanish refused to give up the land, he was authorized to manufacture a suspicion of an existing design of any foreign power, and once done, to call in the U.S. Army and Navy to preoccupy the territory. The problem was that this was illegal unless there was third-party aggression to justify this, and nothing like that existed.
Yeah. Napoleon and the British didn't want it. It's like we've talked about. It's like the Spanish were thoroughly washed at this point, even though they had some, shrewd players in the team, like Vicente Folk. He was not operating from a position of strength. He was fundamentally making the most of like a fairly tenuous position and
changing situation. Yeah, and in part of that changing situation, Spain is now allied with Great Britain and not with France,
right?
Even though they had recently been allies. So this is kind of part of where you get the idea of like Orwellian future changing alliances, like, oh no, we were always allied with the Spanish.
I don't know. I mean, I think
as power grows in that way, I think into an empire, you continue to have that sort of. But moving forward, you have George Matthews. There's a description that it says, it bespeaks Madison's judgment in matters concerning Florida that he dispatched 71-year-old, conspicuously corpulent, eccentric of appearance and demeanor, his Irish brogue, apparently acquired from his immigrant parents, so thick an accent that Americans and Spaniards found his speech incomprehensible, and fondness for wearing his old-fashioned tricorn hats. He would have resembled more like Sancho Panza instead of Uncle Sam on horseback. For decades, those dealing with him dismissed him as a buffoon, but that never seemed to affect his self-esteem. Only known to acknowledge two superiors, George Washington and the Lord Almighty, and later began questioning the former. He was kind of a perfect Florida man in his pointless, fruitless marauding, worthy of De Soto, but even more resembling Juan Ponce de Leon.
Yeah.
And that's a quote from Allman to use a lot of his descriptive language and connections there.
But the character of General George Matthews, we want to take a second with each of these guys, just be like, wow, just admire them for their archetypical nature and the way in which like this sort of dude. And remember too, it's like this is not the only one. This is not the only kind of Irishman. Even we'll get to that soon. But like there are
lots of people like this, and this just becomes one that's significant because Madison pulls him into a meeting and gives him secret orders.
He's kind of like the Yankee like colonizing invader of this area where political power from the Spanish is tenuous, and we have a very different kind of society than the one that has been born and has flourished in many ways to the north. So
yeah, and we'll be talking a lot more about that as we get further along.
And I think in general, though, like the antagonism from the north to Florida, I think it's something that is very misunderstood, and it's one of the things I want us to really be able to unpack with this whole series too. So this is a story of that and how that process goes, and General Matthews is like one of the first major representatives of this, and he's very goofy and silly and laughable in his own way, but there is something very like sinister of him too that will come from this, even if he's a bit of a bumbling fool. So
so here's another quote, although we're not trying to quote too much of the direct text, but this one is also very good. It says, like Ponce, Matthews saw dreams of transforming Florida and empty acres into real estate turn into a nightmare that will cost him his life. Like the myth of Ponce, he went seeking rejuvenation. Having failed in Georgia and Mississippi, Matthews sought conquest to finally put naysayers to shame. With the arrival of Matthews on the scene, the language changes from Spanish to English, but the story remains the same. The perpetual role of people coming to Florida to reinvent themselves stays the same.
And Matthews blunders his way into Florida, and he crosses paths again with his old friend Vicente Folk. Because remember, that's why he got picked for this. He's met this guy. He knows him, and he can ostensibly get a meeting with him. But he is also a secret agent of the United States. He's not technically doing what he's doing, although it is revealed to Fulch, who gets a letter from the president saying that this guy is here as my representative. So it's a very funny sort of like sequence of events in that regard too, of like, this is official but it's not, he has the money but also we're sending another guy. Like, it's very it's very fun.
Yeah,
it's a very good like comedy of errors, this whole thing. I often find myself thinking the stories of Florida would make great prestige television, and this is another one of those where it's like just,
right.
you can just see these guys.
Yeah, so Madison and Matthews' dreams end when they learn that Fulch will no longer capitulate to them and the deal is no longer on the table after Cuba offers them assistance, which, like I said earlier, spoiler alert, that deal is not going to work out.
Yeah.
Fulch is going to get a better deal offered from Cuba.
Yeah.
And so he remains in the deal with Spain, unbeknownst to Matthews. And now Madison, who's eager not to endanger the anticipated peaceful transfer of West Florida to the U.S. now, orders the U.S. Army to crack down on the quote-unquote patriots that are starting to grab this. They're doing illegal settlements, as we talked about before.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason for the secrecy here, too, is that this is all, like, in the political discourse of the day, whatever that meant, is we're not... Are we a country that's taking over Florida? Do we want that? Like, people, America's a country with a lot of opinions, and these things used to carry some weight in this, democracy they're trying to build. So
yeah, and so as there's many different party systems, if you were to look online, you can learn more about the different changing party systems. But a common problem that continuously emerges that should kind of spoil the notion of our founding fathers being these perfectly innocent people is the constant emerging theme of the spoils system. And so you have direct bribery basically being offered on the table because Madison sends a reply to Fulch and he informs Fulch that it would be quote unquote advantageous to betray his Spanish loyalty. And that's when he announces Matthews was on his way, blowing his cover.
So he receives
just
him.
Like, womp womp.
Exactly. And he receives him, and he's very polite, and he says, "Hey, buddy, I have been ordered to fight to the death to protect any of our Florida from the U.S. attempts." And he, pulled off the deal. He got protection from the U.S. and cash from Spain. Although I think it was I think he got cash from. He didn't. He wouldn't get too much protection from the U.S. ultimately, but he did. I think he got cash from both sides.
Yeah, he gets this double cross because he got the military protection from the U.S. where Madison didn't want to spoil the deal, so he tells the Patriots. He calls off the Patriots and sends in the army to suppress them. And then he gets cash from Spain and from Cuba now, which is pretty great for him.
I don't actually think
he kind of won a double-sided victory.
Yeah, because I think
and then he tells the U.S. he won't give them the land, which kind of burns both Matthews and Madison, who believed that Fulch was going to be willing to go in on this deal.
When I was rereading the chapter, I think you might have missed a detail here about specifically how he gets the money too, because it's hilarious. So he gets the money from Cuba. He decides to side with Cuba. It's probably what he wanted to do more than anything else ultimately. But I think that he also got money from President Madison separate from Matthews because President Madison sent a separate envoy with cash just to deliver that separate from Matthews, which I found, and I'll have to double check this in the book.
Even funnier.
Yeah. Right, it's hilarious because it implies that as soon as George Matthews left his office, President Madison was like, okay, and we're going to send a guy with money so that he
more serious.
We're going to send a guy like
someone to make sure that.
So funny. Yeah. Immediately they're just like, this guy's
that's why they ultimately end up having two different versions of the story, which is pretty common, as Allman points out, in blown covert operations when they grab two people and make them corroborate their stories now, and they have completely different versions of the story.
Right.
So we'll get to that.
Right.
But Fulch gets to return home now immediately after this deal gets done in 1787. And he gets court-martialed in response to these extraordinary accomplishments he had, but ultimately gets exonerated and lives to the age of 75. So he's one of the few figures that gets deeply mired in Florida politics who manages to escape and live into old age.
Right.
Again, pretty much without any stain on his legacy.
And so, again, this guy, Vicente Folk, lives to 75. He goes back to Spain, lives a relatively peaceful life, survives a court-martial, exonerates himself. Pretty solid career. General George Matthews is at this point 72. is getting older.
And he's riding on horseback at times.
He's still in Florida. This poor asshole is still in Florida, still trying to make the deal to get some more free real estate, because again, it's like he's like a drug addict for free real estate. He's just like an absolute fiend. It's such a fascinating kind of goofball.
Yeah, so there's this quote from a scholar later on that gets cited in the book, and it says, as a result of, quote, staggering ineptitude on the part of almost everybody on the American side. Right. Any chance of obtaining Florida on the sly had been lost. But inside Matthew's brain, now switching over to Allman's account of it, butterfly wings were flapping. And that's, again, we have that theremin sound.
So he's getting on horseback, and he's decided, okay, I have been sent from the Washington with a mandate from the president to get Florida. Vicente has screwed me. I will, find another way. So he gallops to St. Augustine and demands the Spanish surrender the province to U.S. control on the spot. And this is solely after Americans on both sides of the border warned him that the Spanish governor, Enrique White, would throw him in a dungeon for such a demand. And I love this description. This will get to something I mentioned earlier. So not like Folk, who was an Iberian gentleman who would pour rum and coffee while rejecting his demands, White was a rough and ready Irishman like Matthews himself. Like President Madison, Matthews wanted all of Florida, but like Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, they would all ensnare themselves in a trap of their own design. By insisting so strongly that Florida up to the Perdita River belonged to the U.S., they acknowledged that the rest of it, the whole of what is today the state of Florida, did not belong to the U.S. And, it hits on a few things I mentioned earlier, especially the way in which Florida has been a place for so long where you have so many different diaspora communities coming to sort of like just try and find their way in the world through whatever, means they can, basically. And here you have two representatives of the same diaspora on like opposite sides of this political conflict, and I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, it's again similar to modern times to bring up the comparison to other places that do settler colonialism. And it's like, ultimately, when they're told, once they actually draw an official line, say like after a war that happened, and it's like almost the hard right elements of that society are angry to have drawn a line now and to say, well, this is where now Florida officially ends.
Right.
And there are some people always on the extreme who are like, you just see, like, we want the whole thing.
God, dude.
And just even negotiating in any way becomes like a loss to those people who wanted everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so Spain's sovereignty over East Florida was indisputable, but what if some patriots could be used to overthrow them, as they had already done in Baton Rouge? By then, more than enough Americans had migrated there, but Matthews discovered nobody there wanted to revolt. The planters, merchant, and yeomen were all content under Spanish rule because of economic freedom.
And remember that, too, that, like, even in the midst of this, and before this, too, what led to those first Patriot Wars we mentioned in the last episode, the Spanish are like, open borders, baby. Come on in. We love
exactly,
it.
yeah.
It's an economic boon. People moving to your community makes for, more wealth and prosperity in your community. It's like, if you can't make that work, that's a fucking you problem. That's not them. That's just it's.
Yeah.
Ugh.
And so thanks to it being situated right next to an international border, smuggling slaves was as lucrative as alcohol was during the Prohibition. And so contraband there flourished because the U.S. had banned trade with Britain and France and many of their allies to avoid getting embroiled in European wars shortly after the American Revolution. So now piracy basically flourishes in this region, and this really relates to Prohibition and to things like we talked about the Treaty of Tordesillas and how the Catholic Church telling everybody else besides Spain and Portugal that they can't have access to all the goods in North America, that ultimately secures monopoly and leads to huge profit margins for those who are willing to break the law or to disobey the authority of the Pope. And so you start to have the growing economic incentive for other nations, like the ones who conveniently also end up changing due to the Protestant Reformation.
Right.
This is also due to their economic incentives, ultimately recognizing there's a huge monopoly that's been secured just by the Pope declaring that South America belongs to Portugal and North America belongs to Spain.
Well,
and there's always going to be rational, quote unquote, people who say, well, what if I want that?
Right. Well, there's the note, the sentence I wanted to read here that I think is really great, which is the trade embargo meant U.S. ports were stagnating, but in Florida, close to U.S. yet exempt from its laws, no cargo was forbidden. And that to me felt like this sort of fascinating basis for this. It's not exactly an inversion, but there is this sort of asynchronicity to the way in which the economics of Florida move to the rest of the United States, where it's it's not as simple as when the rest of the U.S. is doing bad, Florida tends to be doing, better than everyone else. But it is sort of again, they're sort of out of step with each other in
a bifurcation
way.
Sometimes.
Yes, there is a real economic bifurcation. And I would say you even see that right now where it's Florida has lots of economic challenges, but it is also still one of the more economically dynamic states in the country. There's actually a rail line in the U.S.
Florida also will be more hit by climate change.
Absolutely.
So it will have different economic challenges that may be more contained in some places and then more devastating in other places in Florida.
Absolutely.
With it just being its own sort of ecosystem.
Well, and something to be said, I think about this a lot, and perhaps people can say this is cope, but it's Florida building code has more or less been geared towards catastrophic weather events for the entire time that, people have been building in Florida. And it's part of why the architecture is, boring and shitty, but it's also, there's a practical purpose for it. And I wonder sometimes about what climate change will look like in places that are maybe a little built from, a little more antiquated and less durable sort of practices. So who knows? I mean, it's not going to be pretty anywhere, and it's certainly not going to be easy in Florida. I would never, delude myself about that. So so it's kind of this early city of sin where sort of fornicators and different deviants could come. Degenerates awesome. Could come and go as they pleased. It was probably pretty awesome. You know what? It's
and it was very, very liberal in a sense. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Across the border in Georgia, segregation would have been much more common. But in Florida, races were free to intermarry, set up mixed-race businesses, and mixed-race children, and they could even pass down their land to colored children, while on the U.S., in the South, this would have been prohibited.
Right. Yeah.
And on U.S. soil, it was as much a crime for black people to read as it was to carry a gun.
Right.
But in Florida, they were free to do both.
Right. And I want to say, in Florida, tradition of racial freedom was established as early as 1693 when Spain granted sanctuary to foreign slaves seeking refuge. And it's, as we said in the first part of the series, the Spanish colonial crimes are deep and myriad, but there did eventually develop a very different sort of relationship and egalitarian sort of understanding between the different peoples of this much more complex and diverse polity that would develop. And again, by the late 17th century, they have granted sanctuary to foreign slaves seeking refuge. In 1783, near St. Augustine, self-emancipated black people established what Professor Kathleen Deegan, curator of historical archaeology at Florida Museum of Natural History, called a fortress Fortress of Freedom. Her archaeological excavation shows the fort and town of Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Moses. It was the first legally sanctioned free black community in the U.S. in 1738. Near St. Augustine. So just think about that. And so in 1776, the country that would have to fight a civil war almost 100 years later over the right to whether or not they could own slaves, there was already a legally sanctioned free black community in the U.S. This does not absolve the Spanish crown by any stretch, but it does tell, I think, a more complicated story about Florida than people like to, digest necessarily, especially about Florida's relation to blackness in America too. I think that's something people don't always understand, but it's that these are identities that are much more complex and diverse than your, friggin' white European person from the Northeast might necessarily be aware of. And the way history is taught in schools certainly does not help this.
Right.
It's kind of unbelievable when you learn about all this stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so the English colonists from Georgia invaded Florida in 1740, and they were repulsed when they were cast into a pitched battle with the black, white, and Indian Spanish forces. Matthews made Amelia Island across the river from St. Mary's his base of operations, and life in the port town of Fernandina foreshadowed the diversity, freedom, and energy synonymous with Florida today. There was a lot of diversity participating in this one wage labor economy.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And so here's a good quote. It says, "The original Florida natives were long extinct, but as Yazoo-type land deals in Georgia and Mississippi territory made hundreds rich by dispossessing thousands, Indian, tribesmen, escaped slaves, and marginalized whites all found sanctuary in Florida. Cotton, indigo, and tobacco do not grow in arid, barren sand. Estates with names like Ashley and Kingsley Plantation, which today lend names to gold resorts and state parks, were contraband entrepot. Whatever claims people had to public uprightness and moral and private morality, slave smuggling was a pervasive source of shame and profit, like rum and cocaine smuggling would become later."
So we're going to mention a character, sort of a lesser, but still very interesting character, a family that this is one of my, I would say, primary critiques of the book overall, even if, again, we love Finding Florida. We'd say you should read the book.
We love this book.
But I should say also that
Absolutely.
I disagree respectfully with Mr. T.D. Allman on his sort of portrayal, of the relationship of Zephaniah and Anna Kingsley, which I'm sure was a complex and interesting one, but ultimately one that I find makes me very uncomfortable, and I don't really feel is one that should be romanticized in necessarily the same way.
He spends a good amount of time in the book romanticizing Zephaniah and Anna Kingsley, who are a prominent interracial socialite couple of Fernandina. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time in this.
But
they're interesting.
Wife, so
but we need to find ways to cut this down, and that's definitely something we both agreed could be cut. So that's probably going to be one of our only mentions.
But again,
they're a little bit more mentioned within the book.
If you bought your wife, we can't co-sign you. We're not going to ship that. That's just not something we can support. It's just very, very funny. The General George Matthews. So he has set up base on Island
Fernandina the island
Fernandina.
Amelia Island.
Yes, Amelia Island, and he is near Fernandina Island, which is a place where many different types of people basically cohabitate, like fur trappers of like mixed origin. You have mixed race families, some of them of quite questionable moral gray areas, but that's Florida at this time too. It's a morally gray place and continues to be, where people try and make the most of what they have, and ultimately it's like no one chooses the circumstances of their birth. And I think that, like, as much as I do, again, can't co-sign anyone who bought their wife, but I understand why T.D. Allman wants to tell all of these like complicated stories here, because it's a complicated place with a story that with a history that's a lot more, I think, compelling when you don't run away from the unpleasant details. So
he makes the comparison that Florida even back then was this global nexus, and that made Florida a global center of the drug trade at the time. And now today, Miami is considered part of the global center of the international drug trade. And also Orlando is considered kind of the global center of a family franchise for taking your family to vacation, which is, of course, we've mentioned earlier. And I think that'll be a little bit more important later on, the Magic Kingdom.
But just the same forces that make all of those places great are making Fernandina at this time a fascinating place. And I want to read this quote because this is a really fantastic one from the book, and I think it gets at the thesis of something I've been really trying to get at throughout this whole series, just about what kind of place is Florida at this time, and what are the people who live there looking at when they see this aggression, really, this like terrorizing aggression coming from the just recently born constitutional republic that is bearing down on them in a lot of ways. So I'm going to read this. So, rich whites, poor whites, and blacks, the destinies of all these Americans were intertwined in Florida. Between these groups, Indians, whose destiny it is to have no place at all. By the time Matthews arrived on the scene, these four protagonist groups, in spite of their many differences, had one thing in common. All four were threatened by his scheme to impose the American system of race, class, and dispossession on Florida. Florida's Indian, black, and mixed-race people all readily discerned that the maintenance of Spanish rule in East Florida was essential to their well-being, as one academic later put it. And, I was actually talking with a friend of mine who used to live in Panama about an interaction he had once while living there with an indigenous group who had basically been able to maintain their claim to their small and not necessarily hospitable bit of like isthmus and island territory that goes all the way back to the Spanish crown. And it's like the Spanish did not give these people the right to live there inherently, and it's messed up in itself, the effects I'm sure they had on them. But it was fascinating to like look into this indigenous culture that had so much intact from their past that those people get erased in the process we're describing. It is genocidal, like it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and so when Matthews got there, Allman makes this comparison of him almost being like a Paul Revere in reverse, because he shows up at this place saying, I'm going to free you all, and they all feel perfectly free in this economic situation where people of all different races are participating together in a wage labor economy. And so in March of 1812, now more than 1 year after the secret meeting with Madison, Matthews would become the impresario of the last great farce of his career, according to Allman. And he said, Matthews, inspired by the existing West Florida Republic, decides to invent the East Florida Republic. And there's a quote here that says, since the declaration needed to be made on Florida soil, Matthews and protégés rowed across St. Mary's River to Florida side. On March 13th, 1812, Matthews' 9 founding fathers declared East Florida's supposed independence, then, just as quickly, pledged to relinquish unto the United States, America, all lands belonging to said province. This proceeding joined with hoisting of the flag of the Republic of East Florida. And here is where we get to the chapter title, The Silhouette of a Soldier in Blue Against a White Background. The soldier has a bayonet mounted and his musket thrust forward, charging the unseen foe.
And I want, again, that motif of this northern colonial aggressor facing southward at this unseen foe. The foe is not depicted. You see the aggression, you see the preparation for battle, the poise to strike. You do not see the enemy, because the point is to make sure that they are erased from history. Like that's a very important part of this whole project. So
then they row back to Georgia. And Matthews pre-configures now an out-of-control CIA case officer And Lieutenant Jacint Laval, the commanding officer in St. Mary's, Georgia, played the role of a straight arrow military man. Here's a quote from the book. It says, "Even with such orders, letting Matthews use U.S. troops to invade the territory of a foreign country would amount to starting a war without Congress declaring it, and would therefore be a violation of his constitutional oath to the U.S. as an Army officer." Laval was particularly outraged when Matthews demanded that he let him use his soldiers to invade Spanish Florida disguised as patriots. Laval correctly pointed out that this would turn the U.S. Army troops into bandits. And this sounds very familiar today, I think.
It's a fascinating scene. It's a really fascinating scene because it's like you have this guy who has this very tenuous but very real direct order from the president to take control of this state, now coming up to a military officer and asking him to do things that are patently illegal and against the oaths that he's been asked to do. And this guy is faced with having to say yes or no.
Yeah.
And that is often, like, we think about like the Bay of Pigs and shit. It's like this is a dynamic that continues to play out in this region of the world to this very second.
Yeah, and speaking of continue to play out, there's, I think, even now we're seeing this where we saw that lame video that the CIA Democrats like Alyssa Slotkin put together.
Exactly.
And it said a pretty basic liberal sentiment that's really been around for hundreds of years now. This idea that if you live in a constitutional republic, it is okay to disobey illegal orders.
Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders.
You can refuse illegal orders.
You must refuse illegal orders.
Right.
And Trump had actually called for these people to be executed for treason, which just goes to show that this is apparently still up for conflict today and still going to be a matter of debate whether or not it's okay to disobey illegal orders, or, as Nixon said, does the president make it legal by definition? If the president does it, it can't be illegal.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition. Exactly.
Well, and this Laval guy, gets his flowers for not doing the demonic choice at that time, but he, obviously this would not be the end of that story. But I'm really glad you got in here this detail about the general continuing the proud Floridian tradition of being really, really annoying and a bad guest. And that's something that we see General Matthews as a way of... Yeah, basically, he gets this guy to say no to him just on principle and then continues to...
live in his house.
His house. Like, how long is it say?
For months, apparently. And,
and
Laval,
it's just an awful guest. Like...
Yeah, so it's like almost like that episode of Spongebob where Squidward presses on SpongeBob's patience by continuously saying, like, well, SpongeBob. I don't know if you remember that one from our childhood, but that's what that made me remember.
It's just the comedy. I mean,
the comedy writes itself.
Again, we're so excited to do this because these are just some truly hilarious, quintessentially like Americana scenes of the fail occupation of Florida that would presage the actual successful one. That would be a lot uglier. So, loser. Let's get into Ralph Isaacs, the second in command for the general here. Let's tell his story.
Yeah, so he gets introduced in the book by this quote here where it says...
Just speaks to the kind of people we're dealing with.
Yeah, it speaks to the sort of people that we're dealing with where anti-Semitism is apparently just the norm. And he said, "Is it possible the government cannot be better furnished with officers than the kinds of Jews, rogues, and traitors and conspirators he saw coming and going from inside his own house?"
Yeah.
And so the Jew in question is Ralph Isaacs, who's this Mississippi speculator whose courtesy title conferred to him by the local militia was Colonel. And in these early forays into Florida, Isaacs becomes basically like Matthew's co-pilot, essentially. So you have a fake colonel and a fake general hanging out together.
I just love that, he's warning him of his follies while acting. It's like, there's just like Don Quixote. Like, it's like it's unbelievably like literary and it's like weirdness.
Yeah, so they're this dysfunctional couple, and Isaacs constantly warns Matthews of his folly while also acting as his chief enabler. And Isaacs is actually the first one to establish contact with folk in West Florida. And also, he's the one who drafts the farcical Declaration of Independence for the Republic of East Florida, because the other signatories, like Matthews, are functionally illiterate.
Yeah.
Which kind of gives me vibes of Charlie Kelly here. He's the Dennis Reynolds to the gang of illiterate fools.
Yeah.
Who is able to scrap together the outline of a supposed constitution, which is really 9 guys coming together.
Right.
And
that's
so
what I was getting to. Yeah, I was trying to jump to that, but it's like and it's not that different of a story than the Constitution that happens up north too. They're a little more detailed, but the best part of that, I feel like, is like you get this group of like the worst of the worst doing a Declaration of Independence, but then it turns out that the Spanish garrison is also just 9 guys. So it's like, that's what I mean. It's like the Spanish don't have that much more like to offer here. So it's like that's why it's like,
yeah, they don't have much stake there yet. They don't think they have to defend it much.
Besides that's, I mean, and because it's the only authority these people respect. Like there's other people there who have, autonomy and sovereignty, but they think of them as like human at the end of the day, and they don't think their political structure. They think that their political structure deserves to be, for their own like liberal pretensions of maybe like anti-monarchy or just whatever the hell, but like they just believe that their political system deserves to be supplanted with this one because it's superior, and like it's that arrogance is so evident in this whole thing.
Right, and so Matthews comes to Laval with this crooked deal, and they basically now personify this eternal dialogue, it seems now, about the unauthorized use of violence, which has gone on for over 200 years.
Does being American give us the right to violate the rules of civilized behavior or confer on us a special obligation? That's the way T.D. Allman puts it, and it's very true.
Exactly, yeah. So Laval's like, I've got responsibilities. I'm supposed to follow a constitution, and that would make me illegal, and that would make the U.S. essentially bandits. So we're supposed to follow the letter of the law. And then you have the classic rogue cop, George Matthews, who essentially is telling him, like, no, you don't have to do that. I'll sweeten the pot for you instead. So another continuity here is that history back then was also being made by flawed humans, as it is today.
Right.
And so Laval might be compared to grand statues like Jefferson or Lincoln, but not even they were like that. And it's equally tempting to treat Matthews humorously, as we've done all throughout this series.
It's hard not to.
But in reality, though, his actions were actually criminal and they were dangerous. And so
there's a very sinister layer to it when you see what comes next,
Yeah. So Laval refuses to provide troops for this invasion, and Matthews incites a mutiny, and then Laval stymies him by posting guards on his own troops, and then actually stands guard himself all night to make sure that George Matthews won't try to overthrow West Florida. And with no U.S. troops to fight, there was no way for Matthews to attack St. Augustine, let alone the entire province, together with all the arms and ordinances, military stores, and fortifications, with everything there, too, appertaining, as the East Florida New Declaration of Independence had invited him to do. So he couldn't seize St. Augustine, but instead tries to grab a little part of Fernandina. And this Declaration of Independence signed by 9 men carries little weight. But then again, the Spanish garrison turns out to only be 9 soldiers as well. So
right. But then, it goes on to be just Matthews doing, I'm trying to start like moving quicker a little bit through it, but like it starts to be like Matthews just promising everything.
Yeah.
Like he's just lying and lying. Like another classic, again, like we said, classic Florida guy move, being a terrible guest, being annoying, also lying a lot. There you go. See, like say over promising, under delivering. Like this guy.
Yeah, exactly.
he's hitting all the notes. It's amazing. And these are American things too. These aren't just Florida things. These are American things.
Yeah, he promises to give Florida's state Catholic priests pensions because they're Spanish, and that's not really possible at this time, and won't be possible until after the Civil War, when the first pensions are issued for soldiers in the northern states. That's when there's finally this kind of executive authority to do that. But this is clearly illegal at the time when George Matthews is promising that. But what he is doing is handing out guns and ammo to all the wood choppers and boatsmen in the neighborhood of St. Mary's, as one account puts it. And these freelance invaders were promised happy looting plus 500 acres of Spanish land apiece. Free real estate. And as this undisciplined throng moved towards Fernandina, the Spanish commander, Colonel Justo Lopez, convoked a committee of public safety. Lopez did what white Americans have always feared by distributing arms and ammo to free blacks and slaves.
Yeah.
Even given the above offer, these Americans remained loyal to the Amelia Island Spanish rule.
Yeah.
This did not become a conflict between the English and Spanish races.
Nope.
Though the Spanish still ruled, the conflict had already become a dispute amongst Americans.
Yeah, exactly. That's like the whole story of this thing we're trying to say. And this is where we have another shrewd Spanish dealmaker working with the late era colonial military, able to sort of diffuse the situation, even though it's become quite tense. And as we said, it's like that's a theme that will come up again and again in this that we want you to see, is like the way in which Florida is the nexus of the non-white oppressed peoples, blacks, like, you know, Spanish speaking, and the indigenous peoples all being resistant to the northern nation that's being built, that they understand to be antagonistic to their very sense of like you know, humanity. So even if it's complicated and there's like things we don't agree with, it's still a compelling scene that, you know, tell us about this Lopez guy. What does he do to diffuse the situation?
Yeah, so now Lopez has a chance to maneuver like Fulch had before him, and he seizes on it, but no blood flows because of the irregularity of this situation. So the essential question that Lopez had the presence of mind to recognize was whether the U.S. had authorized this aggression. This was a classic covert op gone out of control. When Lopez coolly asked the Americans to explain to him who had ordered the attack, he encountered that classic symptom of a covert operation that has spun out of control. U.S. officials speaking with two opposing voices. I have the greatest satisfaction in informing you that the U.S. are neither principals nor auxiliaries, and that I am not authorized to make any attack upon East Florida, Lieutenant Lavelle informed the Spanish. However, Matthews informed Lopez, I have instructions from my government to receive East Florida or any part of it from the local authorities, or to take it by force to prevent its occupation by a foreign power.
Right. You know, the reread of this, I really noticed how much T.D. Allman will impress upon you how this does like presage and prefigure the out of control intelligence operations you see in, you know, Operation Ajax not too long after this. It's like, it's very, very interesting.
Or the Bay of Pigs.
Exactly. Like, it's just amazing how this is sort of like this American operation of expansion, that almost the same mechanisms in almost the same ways end up playing out. And it's just like so fascinating to observe.
Yeah, it's always the executive branch authorizing it in a covert way and then saying, no, I didn't do that, when he gets caught red-handed. Yeah, so...
Oh, it's the only move. It's the only move we have. It's so obvious.
Yeah, so sensing opportunity, Lopez sends Clark across in a rowboat to negotiate. Capitulation had something in it for everyone. Lopez agreed to surrender Amelia Island to the Patriots in return for calling off the attack. Lopez knew, but Matthews apparently didn't, that since neither Spain nor U.S. ever recognized the East Florida Republic, this later would allow both Spanish and American governments to pretend that, legally speaking, nothing happened. So Lopez could consider...
Oh, God, I forgot how cool that is. It's so funny. It's just like a bureaucratic shuffle, just got his...
Yeah, so Lopez plays him. He basically says, oh yeah, sure, George, I'm going to recognize your republic, knowing that this isn't a real process in any way, but just kind of shoos him off.
In front of him. So good. It's like the way you see that Trump is I love Sheinbaum, she's really great, she always jingles the best keys in front of me. It's the same thing. There's so many echoes of history that you just love to see, and I shout out to the shrewd Spanish speaking operators of the Pan-Caribbean region
to this day
to navigate to the Gustavo Petros and stuff like that. Shouts out, man. It's not an easy world.
Yeah, so Lopez could consider this surrender a temporary expedient, as it proved to be, and only the Georgia ragamuffins had reason for disappointment, as the Patriots and Spanish joined forces to preserve law and order. There was no looting, and no one was promised 500 acres either.
All right.
The next day, on March 18th, 1812, was the last glorious day of Matthews' bizarre long life, since his East Florida flag, having been raised the night before, was lowered for the last time.
This man is
so he's super sad now. And on Matthews' order, now the American stars and stripes are unfurled.
Nice.
So almost 14 months after Matthews and Madison hatched the first plan now, Matthews was getting some of the land handed over to him by an existing local authority. So yeah, we got to drop a free real estate there.
We got a little bit of free real estate.
It's free real estate. On the Georgia side of the river, Lieutenant Laval's immediate superior, Colonel Thomas Smith, resumed command after a long absence. So now the French-born Lieutenant Laval marched to St. Augustine, and Matthews went by boat. And while he untethered his ship, he shouted, "On to Venezuela!" And Venezuela will come up even more as we get further along in this.
But can you believe it? Isn't it just too on the nose,
Uncanny,
dear listener?
yeah.
Isn't it just a little unreal how it's just the same story?
After we conquer Florida, we'll move on to Venezuela.
As they call it. Yeah. And I'll tell you, man, I still don't feel Florida can be fully considered conquered. It's still a mess of a place, and the hurricanes are still quite terrifying. So, and it's...
So Matthews' force triples to about 300 men by the time he reaches St. Augustine.
It's so funny to think by this point he's gotten the most popular he'll become in Florida too. This roving gang.
Yeah, this is now the height of his popularity, having a gang of 300 guys.
This weird roving escapade he's been on has now gone to quadrupled 300 times its original size or something. It's ridiculous, dude. It's so but horrible too.
Yeah.
It's what who are these 300 guys who saw this 70-plus-year-old man who's the president told me I'm going to take over Florida? They're yeah, all right.
Right. And now, in a violation of U.S. law and treaty, Laval's replacement, acting without orders, sends more than 100 troops to join the invasion. So yeah, as you said, this is the height now of the size of this mob. They even have 100 soldiers, official soldiers, backing them from the U.S. And it says, this had happened before, the headlong charge south, followed by Spain's peevish refusal to give up the fort. The first time was 110 years ago in 1702, and then twice more when colonists from Georgia had attacked. The fort held on every occasion, even when the invaders had burned St. Augustine. Now this time was Matthews' turn, and the U.S. Army and the Patriots, who were slapping mosquitoes and bickering amongst themselves, while inside the Castillo de San Marcos, the defenders sat tight. And that's the parallels then to the Menendez story earlier with the mosquitoes.
Yeah.
So on every previous occasion, the attackers eventually withdrew within days or weeks. It was all happening again, but now this time there was one difference. On previous occasions, these countries were at war with Spain. This time, they were not.
Yeah.
Matthew's men had no training for combat, and their force remained too small and poorly equipped to overrun the Castillo, where the cannonballs bounced off the coquina limestone ramparts with no effect. An American military strategist at the time judged that it would take most of the U.S. Navy to block the Matanzas Inlet successfully. Even that could not have stopped the hostile black Spaniards and Seminoles from picking them off one by one. So Matthew's followers then expected to be welcomed by smiling, beautiful women, and it was said that some Americans were out for a swim and actually noticed some lovely Menorcan ladies cleaning themselves. And when they went to join the women, the Menorcan men sprang out into view and slit their throats. And then there is a quote that says, "There comes a turning point in every failed siege when the besiegers' dream of victory is overtaken by the panic-stricken need to go home." As Matthew's forces started to dribble into nothingness, other stories of authentic provenance circulated.
That's the drive you see throughout the Crusades, too. That's part of what makes those so, goofy while also, horrifying. And it's like this bravado that turns into, now we're in the middle of this swamp and people are trying to kill us. And it's yeah, dude.
That's kind of what you signed up for.
So, yeah, man.
Yeah, so then the Spanish armed 150 black soldiers as well as civilians in St. Augustine, and more African troops were on the way from Havana. The pro-Spanish guerrillas attacked a group of Americans and killed 14 of them. For Matthew's amateur conquistadors, the Florida surrounding them had suddenly become like the Florida surrounding DeSoto in that painting in the Jacksonville Museum that we referenced earlier, and that is the cover of the series. Sent to grab Florida on the sly, Matthews created a political fiasco in which the U.S., faced with the same two choices it would face in other controversial conflicts, either to admit defeat or to escalate. Governor David Mitchell of Georgia, a noted frontier fighter, was sent down to see what could be done. He was expected to call for more U.S. troops, but he returned with the assessment that Matthews' force was primarily a danger to itself.
God, they're just the most fail guy, but again, it's like the sinister nature of this guy's conquest is not, over. That's what's so awful, is it's like this dipshit is just the beginning.
Yeah, it starts as a farce, and then it becomes a tragedy, as we say.
Yeah, that's the Allman line, too.
Yeah, when it came to chasing the Spanish out of St. Augustine, Mitchell concluded that overrunning the Castillo would cost more money and more lives than it cost the British to take Quebec during the French and Indian War. There was no need for an official press clearance to find out what a fool Matthews had made of the U.S. thanks to America's freedom of the press.
Right.
Disgraceful in the extreme, commented the Charleston Courier in an article criticizing the farce of receiving the province from a handful of insurgents in such a manner.
Well, and I want to say, too, that, this is a cultural current I want to highlight as well, that this book did such a great job of highlighting, and I think is such an important thing to understand, is this American Florida shame, this idea of this sort of British style, we don't want to talk about what's going on down there sort of thing that has been going on for a very long time. And it, the language barrier helps to some extent too, but I think it's just generally something you see still to this day in a ancestor of the like Florida man, like the general like willingness and desire to write off Florida as this thing that shouldn't be our problem and we should just not like, worry about anymore, because now that we have fully like subsumed it into the US, it's like that part of the story. It's a great way to make sure that never gets dredged up.
Right.
And I think that it's very important.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing this book has made me really feel very strongly.
Yeah.
And that's, one of the reasons I wanted to really center it in there. It's a great book.
Right. And now again, the echoes of history repeating yet again. Spain's representatives meet with the Secretary of State Monroe and President Madison, and they ask the same question that Lopez had in Fernandina, and the same one that Philip II had diplomatically asked more than 250 years earlier about the Menendez massacres. He asked, had or had not the U.S. authorized these attacks on Florida?
Right.
This dispute caused Secretary of State Monroe to finally leaf through the reports Matthews had been sending to Washington. He obviously had been sending just volumes of reports that nobody was reading because he was just this insane guy, and that was kind of like the fallback plan. And he had other plans going on too.
Irish guy.
He finally cracks open
the
letters that
he probably looked like a handbag.
Yeah.
He probably had the leatheriest skin.
Yeah, and he cracks open the letters that had been sending, and President Madison himself observes in the letter to Jefferson that Matthews has been playing a strange comedy. His extravagances place us in the most distressing dilemmas.
So funny, so hoity-toity, so proper. There's just this very like English like pretensions of class. I mean, there's just like the only word for it, I think, is just like
and so this moment calls for a tactic that we'll later call plausible deniability. But there's a great quote here of President Monroe writing to George Matthews, and he says,
"Yes, this is this sums the whole thing up."
Yeah, you want to read that one?
Yeah, sure. I am sorry to have to state that the measure which you appear to have adopted for obtaining possessions of Amelia Island and other parts of Florida are not authorized by the law of the U.S. or the instructions founded on it under which you have acted. You were authorized by law and instructions to take East Florida only on peaceful delivery by the governor or other existing local authority, or to forestall occupation by a foreign power, an unseen foe. Remember the aggression of those 6 Spanish guys. They're over there really playing guitar and being aggressive.
Yeah, silly Matthews. I didn't tell you to invade Florida by any means necessary. You're misremembering.
Monroe then modulated into an outright lie. In any case, a forceful wresting of the province from Spain was never contemplated, but only an occupation until a settlement could be reached by future amicable negotiation with Spain.
Yeah, so Matthews had no intention of stopping now. Earlier, after being denied governorship of Mississippi Territory, he had set out for Washington intending to chastise President John Adams. Adams deflected Matthews' wrath by appointing one of his sons to the post of public relations in Georgia. So there again, you have that spoils system that President Adams says to get this guy out of his hair. He says, I'll just make your son some sort of position in Georgia if you'll leave me alone. And he's able to do that, to just create this post of public relations in Florida for George Matthews' son. And of course, that's why later there will be criticisms of a spoils system. Because how else are you going to make a government? You're going to staff it with your friends.
Right. Well, this guy's like an early crusade. He's like a weird, like a neo-crusader almost in his own weird way. He has to have this like vaunted position for his sacrifice, even if it amounted to just a pile of shit and would become like he dies, just for the record too. We're in August 30th, 1812, Mr. Matthews dies.
Yeah, but he had headed north looking for, in his words, revenge, and vowed to blow them all up in Washington, were also some of his words. And on his way up north on his 73rd birthday, August 30th, 1812, Matthews dies. Governor Mitchell of Georgia, who had recognized the folly of attacking St. Augustine, did his best to eulogize Matthews, and he said, "Whatever political errors he may have fallen into in the course of a long public life, let them rest in oblivion." That advice was not followed. Instead of being forgotten, Matthews was turned into one of the first of Florida's many fake heroes, a kind of proto-Confederate cavalier. The pure-hearted martyr to a noble, lost cause. The victim of a covetous but vacillating administration, which he served faithfully. And that's kind of true. The administration did vacillate. Clearly, they did give him commands.
Of course.
Yeah, and then they suddenly,
of course,
as they've done multiple times.
Of shared interests.
Yeah.
This guy was obsessed with free real estate. I mean, it's like exactly what the state at that time would be interested in, especially
was exploiting this guy, taking advantage of him, and then throwing him out, as they done with the Kemper brothers, too.
Right, and they had this psychic phantom of the Spanish imperial ambitions that it's hard to say how seriously they really took that, or whether they just saw that as a stalking horse for what they wanted and knew was pragmatic, which was to own as much of the land as possible.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's they were never going to allow for such a non-centralized political system to exist in equal to the United States of America.
Yes.
And that was just, they felt an inevitability, as they felt with Cuba.
Yep.
And, still kind of feel, obviously.
Yeah, and so to continue that quote, it says, as late as 1954, Matthews was still being portrayed as a well-meaning victim. His services in the Revolutionary War, his work in Congress, his contribution as governor of Georgia, had almost been wiped from the memory of man by the Yazoo land frauds, wrote one admirer that year. The Secretary of War had denounced him, senators had shied away from him, President Adams had failed him. During those long and lean political years, he listened for opportunity's knock. Now, in the evening of life, Matthews thought he heard that knock. Through the door he opened, he perceived Florida. Then, in Matthews' real story, just as in Ponce's mythical one, his dream, as he acted it out in Florida, turned out to be nothing more than the figment of imagination, the hallucination of old age. This repudiation of Matthews was but a paper maneuver, one chronicler later noted. And that's true. So, as I said, the vacillating administration, they did come out and condemn his actions later, even though they had actually encouraged him to do that in the first place.
Right, exactly.
And so,
same for the Kemper brothers, like you said.
Yeah, and there's the parallels, too, to the modern Bay of Pigs, because Madison wanted all of Florida, but his actions there caused an embarrassing disaster, and it turned out that 1812 was a presidential election year. So, being ready to do anything for a second term, Madison started a much bigger, far more disastrous war. And does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
When his local militia was summoned, Jefferson noted all but 10 of the 241 men crowded into town, eager to attack America's neighbors. So that was kind of the social base at the time, that only 10 out of 241 refused to go invade the neighbor right then and there. And then the only inquiry is whether they are to go to Canada or Florida, Jefferson said to Madison. Florida historian Rembrandt Patrick compared the U.S. at this point to a, quote, fledgling vulture which hovered outside the vortex of world conflicts, hoping to snatch tempting morsels in North America from England and her weak dependent ally Spain.
Yep.
The vulture was about to lose a lot of its feathers. Like Matthews' advance on St. Augustine, the U.S. attack on Canada began with pronouncements about freedom, and then it ended in retreat. Detroit was lost, along with parts of Maine and upstate New York. Madison did win his second term, but the war didn't end until 1815. By then, Washington was burned and Baltimore had been bombarded. There was still a question over whether Britain would give up the parts which it had taken, but it also would be wrong to say that there were no territorial gains. The U.S. had declared war on Britain, but there was no declaration of war with Spain before attacking West Florida. The U.S. failed to conquer California, but it did seize 2 little bits of the Gulf of Mexico. America's stated purpose had been to defend its rights as a neutral nation, but now, as a result of its unprovoked aggression against a neutral nation that helped them to win the War of Independence, America finally controlled the Gulf coastal strip, which President Jefferson had first purported belonged to America in 1803. There was a sleight of hand here because President Madison had given back part of East Florida that Matthews had seized with his right hand while taking part of West Florida with his left hand. And this was America's only territorial gain from the War of 1812. The U.S.'s seizure of Mobile, Alabama, finally produced the foreign threat that the president had hoped to provoke. In response to this, the British took over the defense of nearby Pensacola. If the conditions were reversed, Madison and Monroe would have called this a preoccupation to forestall further aggression, but instead they said that this British move provided an excuse for yet another Florida invasion.
Right.
So earlier they had called this sort of act of sending soldiers to occupy a territory, they said, no, that's a preoccupation when we do it. But because Britain did their own little preoccupation after the war, they said that that's an aggressive act, and that supposedly gave them the right to invade a completely different area, West Florida.
Right.
So, in late 1814, the U.S. troops advanced on Pensacola, and it seemed that the climactic battle in the British-American War was about to be fought on Spanish territory.
Right.
But then, suddenly, the British sailed away, deciding to attack New Orleans instead. The U.S. forces abandoned Spanish Pensacola as abruptly as they had seized it and got to Louisiana just in time. The British were expecting no more resistance there than they had encountered when they burned Washington, but on January 8th, 1815, the U.S. forces killed and wounded a total of 2,055 British officers and men, while only 101 Americans had fallen. Yeah, they completely blew them out. And then this was a total massacre, the most consequential massacre of white men by white men in North America between the end of the War of Independence and the U.S. Civil War. And then that's the end of Chapter 6, and now we're moving on to Chapter 7.
I think we should stop here and leave that moment there where the U.S. absolutely blow out the British in New Orleans at the War of in 1814, because that is the entree of Old Hickory into American politics, and that is who we're really going to get into in detail in the next one. I think we just probably spent a little more time than we went to on Matthews, but it was awesome. And this is such a good place to end off because I wrote something that I think leads very nicely into the next chapter. So if that's okay with you, I'd like to just read this and cut it off here. Is that all right?
That's okay with me. We're moving one chapter at a time, but that's all right.
I mean, you keep trying to do two, but you'd like to read the book, my friend.
It's hard.
It's hard. It's a great book, and we probably read more of the book than any of our past episodes in this one, but goddamn, there's a lot of great scenes, and we're adding our color commentary, and I'm going to give you this bit of on-the-ground reporting, dear listeners, so get ready, because I was able to take a trip through the lovely city of Savannah, Georgia recently and see some statues and observe some history. And we mentioned Georgia quite a bit in this chapter, actually. And like I said, at some point we probably should do a deep dive into the Georgia colony and James Oglethorpe and people of that nature. But I was surprised how little I knew about these people going through the place and learning about them. And I'm just going to read what I wrote about my time in Savannah. So on a recent trip I was able to take through Savannah, Georgia, I was faced with a monument of James Oglethorpe, the founder of the Georgia British colony. The statue faces south, is dressed in his British military uniform, and carries a palm frond and a sword. The plaque near the sign says that these choices were made to symbolize the threat of Spain's imperial ambitions to the young colony. And this statue was erected right at the dawn of the 20th century when this was put up at like 1901, I believe. And it was not some distant and obscure memory what the imperial ambitions of Spain looked like in the southeast at this time. It is my hope, dear listener, that after hearing the story we have just told you about the decades preceding the erection of this statue, you can understand that the implied threat behind such a statue towards an unseen foe did a lot more to sanctify and immortalize the racial conquest of Florida into a coded historiography where Spanish aggression becomes a totem for the idea of a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. On the very next street from the Oglethorpe Monument that I just mentioned, there's another plaque for the old Sorrel Weed House, it's called. And that tells the story of a family whose progeny was rescued from sharing the same fate of the small whites in Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution, which, to anyone familiar, not a good time. Not a place you wanted to be. Didn't want to be the small whites. That was a bad time for them. But that same child who was rescued by, let's be unambiguous, the slave that their family owned, the person who took care of them as a slave, that same child then went on to serve as a Confederate officer. No mention is made on this plaque of the freedom of this person who they are ostensibly so grateful to. Jenkins' ear, my ass. That's my thought on that.
Yeah, and that actually. Oh, sorry. I got more to say. So no worries.
It's a common refrain among all leftists and even many regular Americans to say that we should just let Florida sink into the ocean. And in the course of reading and researching for this series, I have come to believe that is a vestige of an old and bigoted complex about what kind of society Florida is that predates even the Confederacy. And now as we stand at the precipice of war with Venezuela, with Uncle Sam about to get back in his neocolonial imperial bag, I grow deeper in my conviction every day that it is a profound failure of the Western left to write off Florida as a lost cause. It does the heavy lifting of erasing all of the people who scrambled, fought, and died pursuing some measure of liberty and freedom and personal sovereignty for themselves and their communities and their families.
Yeah.
Trying to find some safe harbor in the nightmare of history they have been dragged into.
Right.
It leaves the myriad marginalized people who still reside in Florida with a historically grounded impression that their neighbors to the north do not see them as equal members in this country and never will.
Right.
It leaves open the opportunity for the worst and most persistent elements of Floridian society to continue to behave as if they are the only game in town. Because as long as the only refrain from leftists is just let it sink, it always will be.
Yeah.
Even deeper, Florida has always been an international space. Any peninsula is kind of destined to be by geography. You got a lot of ports. So there are more diaspora communities in the Caribbean and Florida in particular than almost anywhere else in America. And in its relationship to colonialism, Florida has more in common with the Third World than many other parts of America. It is no wonder that the expectations for the Western left are so low when the rest of the world can see how quick Americans are to abandon their own ostensible countrymen for the crime of being born and or choosing to live in a low-lying area near the water.
Yeah.
The fate of Florida and the fate of much of the Third World are intertwined, whether we like it or not. If we cannot articulate a positive vision of the future for people threatened by climate change within our own country's borders, ostensibly, then we can never expect to be taken seriously as a liberatory movement or anything, anywhere in the world. It's a profound moral failure, in my opinion. And that's where I wanted to leave that. So
yeah, I've heard talk about a need on the left for a 50 states campaign, one that doesn't neglect the Rust Belt states like Hillary Clinton's campaign did and things like that. Right. And that speaks to that, of just saying like, oh, well, there's these states that are ungettable. You end up completely precluding your movement from creating an ideology that really could resonate with everybody. And then also, I think that relates to something that we had missed at the very beginning of Chapter 6, which Allman had compared Madison's behavior almost to acting on a preliminary idea of like the domino theory, because he worried that losing this land to the Spanish would suddenly create a chain reaction, as you said, of Spanish aggression, quote unquote, which was really that if enough of America wanted to break off and live more like Spain and not be a white ethno state, that posed an existential threat to the colonies that the U.S. was building.
We did miss that, but that's something that T.D. Allman does a great time underscoring, is that it's so obvious, and this will become even more obvious in the next chapter, dear listener, and thank you for coming this far if you have, that the United States at this time views free colored people living and trading amongst themselves in their own communities as an existential threat to be disrupted and to be extinguished. And that is old Hickory himself, who, like we said, just made his bones by slaughtering a bunch of British dudes and showing that he is not to be with, and he is an absolute killer. And that is who, it's a brutal society that we're seeing. Like, when you shift the perspective a little bit, it's hard to see it any other way. And that when I'll tell you, when I stood in front of that statue, that just shook me a little bit. It felt like it was this strange sort of like...
On a statue writing about Spanish aggression.
About Spanish aggression from the dawn of the 19th century, acting... Exactly, and it's like you said, where it's like there's no portrayal of the enemy. It's just like the victors and their spoils. And it was... Whew, I'll tell you, man, Savannah's a beautiful place. It's like Confederate Boston. It's a very... and not even spitting distance from these two statues as well. Thank God we talked more. Are 16-ton granite columns shipped down from Quincy, Massachusetts. So it's all tied together, folks. All goes back to the same thing. So, people call it Freemasons. I call it capitalism. It's really it's that simple.
Secret
it's not
in your society.
And the power of labor too, man. I mean, like, humans can do amazing things even at that time. So better things are possible, even in Florida. Don't give up on it. It's a pretty cool place in a lot of ways, even if it's got its profoundly flawed parts of its story. So, you got anything else you want to say before we sign off there, friend?
No, I think that's good. We'll talk to you later in Chapter 7.
Yeah.
The Americanization at Fort Negro.
Yeah, we'll catch you on Chapter 7. It's going to get ugly.
And we don't like using that word ourselves, by the way. That's just
but it is
what it was called
right
at that time, and it's used in the text.
Yeah. And it's better than the name it has now. That's kind of the problem,
too.
Fort
Gadsden.
Well, if you got any suggestions between now and then on what we should call it throughout the series, just let us know. Maybe we'll find another word for black.
Let's start a petition.
Yeah, Fort Negro. I don't know. We'll figure it out. But thank you for listening. If you've come this far, it's a great book. Give it a read, and we appreciate you subscribing. If you're subscribed, it's cool. It means a lot. It makes you cooler. And Comrade Shark, we thank you if you're listening, and anyone else, really. That continues to be the best handle of our subscriber that we have that I'm aware of. If you think you have a better handle, let me know. I love a good handle. So, yeah. You got anything else? You good?
No, with that said, I think we can handle our way out of here.
Wow. Even better. Nice, dude. Nice. All right. Yeah, just give it a fart noise too, and then we'll go. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.